All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the Cryosphere Pavilion. Thank you so much for joining us on this side event about marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean and their role in adaptation. I'm very excited first to introduce Sylvia Earle from Mission Blue and an explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society. To kick things off, I've been asked to just hit play on a video and then, first Sylvia, and then we'll kick things off with a video.
Those of you who have not caught up with the change in schedule, I am not Enrique Sala, but I am a fellow explorer in residence at the National Geographic and founder of Mission Blue, and a great champion of the topic at hand, which is to do whatever it is we can on our watch to look at the whole ocean, but with a special reference to that southernmost part, the waters around Antarctica, the continent itself. You know, a few decades ago, with some great source of inspiration, nations around the world decided to protect Antarctica, sort of as a common heritage. But they forgot about the ocean. Why? I mean, when you think our journey over thousands of years, it was only 500 years ago that the first circumnavigation of the world took place. Only 200 years ago that Antarctica was sighted officially. And as far as humans are concerned, it went on the map. Before then, it was a big question mark. What's down there? Nobody really officially knew. It did not take long before exploitation set in motion on the land as well as in the surrounding water. But again, humans have this capacity to think, to look at the evidence, and sometimes get it right. For the most part, now, we've stopped killing whales. We've stopped killing the penguins. We've stopped the killing of the birds and the mammals. We haven't stopped killing the fish. We haven't stopped killing the krill. We are killing the birds and the whales and the seals and all the rest inadvertently because we're killing what they eat. And we just haven't quite got things in focus yet. We still have this idea that was born of centuries of thinking. It's still a widely held view that somehow the ocean is different, that it's too big to fail, that it's so vast, so resilient, that we can put anything into it and take anything out of it that we want. So, look around the world. Conservation has largely been about the land. We've come a long way in 100 years in terms of protecting birds and mammals, but we have still a long way to go. But as compared to our regard for wildlife in the ocean, we're way ahead in terms of terrestrial policies and attitudes, migration routes, connecting in a global scale what goes on the land. With climate, until Paris, the ocean was largely kind of an afterthought, like, oh yes, the ocean. Fortunately here, at what I think rightly should be called the blue COP, where the ocean is coming into focus, particularly the Southern Ocean. Why? There's the best chance we will ever have right now. Now, the next 10 years, that's what climate scientists say. We have 10 years to really make the shift from this, well, it's actually to this in terms of CO2. But we have a chance, armed with knowledge that could not exist, not 500 years ago, not 200 years ago, not even 50 years ago. But now we know, and now we have a chance to look at what works, look what the problems are, look what the solutions are. What can we do now, looking at the evidence that, well, you've heard it here, if you've been attending some of these sessions, blue carbon. It's not just about trees. It's not just about curtailing carbon emissions. It's about those things, of course, but it's about protecting the ocean that drives climate, shapes the chemistry of the planet. Big issue about ocean acidification as it relates to climate. Big issue about deoxygenation as it relates to everything. But we are so fortunate, all of us. I think about the kids who are growing up armed with what I couldn't know as a kid because nobody knew. It was 50 years ago that for the first time, humankind got to see that it all connects with that image of Earth from space called Earthrise, when that young Bill Anders took the photograph that really has gone a long way toward changing everything. But we still have a long way to go. And when I think about the proposals that are now underway to at last getting around to take significant steps to expand what some have already looked at as bold actions with the Ross Sea as a major step in the right direction. But it is just that, a step in the right direction. How is it that we're so good at protecting the land and so blind about protecting the surrounding sea, which is, after all, part of the global commons? It's high seas. It doesn't really belong to any one nation. It belongs to everyone, everywhere. And with a magnified significance, we're all the beneficiaries, or we are the ones who will feel the impact of what we do or fail to do in the Southern Ocean, in the waters around Antarctica. It has a magnified impact beyond other parts of the world, although it does all connect when you look at both polar regions as bookends on what have a magnified impact on shaping the ocean, shaping the atmosphere, shaping life on Earth. Really, when we think about what's the value of protecting the Southern Ocean, you can think about, okay, you can get more krill to kill if you protect this part of the ocean, or you have more Patagonian toothfish, Chilean sea bass, or whatever you want to call them, if you protect some part of their range. But really, the living ocean is what we should be valuing. Live krill are worth a whole lot more than dead krill, no matter how you measure the value by current human standards. We need them. Whales need them. Birds need them. The future needs them. So I am privileged to be here, just to sound off a little bit. Pardon me while I vent. You know these things. It's your job. It's my job to take that message and use your megaphone, whatever you have available to you, to share the urgency of protecting everything that we can of the natural world that is still in pretty good shape. And despite what's been taken from the Southern Ocean, we still have the best chance we will ever have right now to take action, to embrace as much of it as we can with true care, because it matters economically, ecologically. It matters to our very existence. Now we know. So, I have with me a film that Enrique would have introduced on behalf of National Geographic and the governments of both Chile and Argentina, scientists who collaborated on an expedition to the western Antarctic Peninsula. I was fortunate to see the ship that you will see on this video, but I was on the land. I was there, in fact, with President Sebastián Piñera, visiting the Chilean research station. And to hear President Pinera say, as maybe you have heard him say one way or the other. This is the first generation able to understand the magnitude of the problems we now face. It's the last generation, the last best generation, able to do something about it. So with that in mind, please, let's go to sea. Let's dive in. Let's look down. And if you haven't already seen BBC's Blue Planet 2, to get into a little submersible vicariously, go down and see this amazing diversity of sponges and coral reefs and colorful creatures that are 1,000 meters down. Who knew? Some of us suspected, based on evidence from elsewhere, but we now have the reality that the Southern Ocean is far from a barren place. It's one of the richest, most highly diverse, most important parts of the planet. We have a chance to do something about it, to secure its future and our own. Thank you.
Sorry about this.
The Antarctic Peninsula. A vast white wilderness shaped by ice, wind, and waves. The tip of a remote frozen continent that regulates our climate. It supports one of the largest food webs on the planet. A team of scientists from Argentina, Chile, and National Geographic is here on the western Antarctic Peninsula to support a bold plan for conservation. Aboard the Chilean naval vessel, the OPV Marinero Fuente Alba, they're on a mission to explore, document, and help protect what is truly one of the planet's last remaining wildernesses.
This is a binational initiative. We have scientists from Chile and Argentina working together for science and to protect Antarctica. Chile and Argentina have recently put forward a proposal to protect Antarctic Peninsula's ocean. We've organized this expedition to fill some scientific gaps.
Although there's been plenty of research here, the ocean environment always needs more attention. The scientists will conduct underwater scuba surveys and deploy deep water cameras to collect data that will support Argentina and Chile's proposal.
It's imperative that we collect good scientific data, get good information to help conserve this place now, because there's no place like Antarctica on Earth. You expect Antarctica to be dreary and cold, lifeless, but once you get down, it's amazing. There are these sea squirts and sponges and soft corals and everything you could possibly imagine.
The diverse scientific transects reveal that while the overall biomass here is high, the number of species is low.
There's not a lot of redundancy in the system here. Each element of the ecosystem is critical to the existence of the entire ecosystem.
The species who've managed to thrive in this harsh environment have evolved together in very stable and very cold conditions over thousands of years. Now the fragile balance in this underwater world is threatened as the climate warms.
Quería estudiar cómo las comunidades del fondo del mar están respondiendo al retroceso de los glaciares. Básicamente lo que hacemos nosotros es, a través de transectas fotográficas a lo largo de una línea recta, es ir cuantificando la diversidad que hay en el fondo del mar. Repitiendo los mismos puntos de muestreo, con las mismas técnicas, podemos ver cómo va cambiando la estructura de las comunidades debido al retroceso de los glaciares.
Global warming also threatens the abundant sponges that provide habitat, food, and even sequester carbon.
I've been monitoring sponges, trying to assess their responses to climate change, mainly to increased temperature. They're normally good indicators because when the environment is changing, they're not able to escape. So far, we have been detecting that some sponges might be able to cope with an increase in temperature of about 2 degrees.
We don't know what's going to happen if the water temperature increases a few degrees more.
Things can become out of balance very, very quickly. If we lose one of those elements, the entire ecosystem is in danger of collapse.
Esta región de la península antártica enfrenta dos grandes presiones. Una es el cambio climático y la otra es la pesquería comercial de krill antártico.
Krill is the key element of this tightly bound ecosystem and the source of all life in Antarctica. So knowing where krill congregate is one of the keys to protecting the wildlife here.
So a drop camera, basically it's a robotic camera system that allows us to, from any ship or any small boat, do a deep sea survey.
The cameras reveal krill on every deployment, at times more than 100 individuals per frame.
Si podemos determinar que estas son áreas importantes para la crianza del krill, esto significa entonces que estas áreas debemos preservarlas.
The problem with the krill fishery is not so much how much krill they're fishing. It's about how much, when, and where. The fishery has been concentrating, especially in the last 10 years, in certain areas which are very important foraging areas for penguins, seals, whales, and so on.
Entonces, eso es lo que nosotros estamos tratando de entender. ¿Cuánto se puede pescar para que no afecte a las poblaciones, ni a las presas ni a sus predadores?
Since 2012, Chile and Argentina have gathered more than 150 layers of data, proposing a marine protected area that will benefit both the ecosystem and the fisheries.
Marine protected areas have multiple benefits. It's not just about conserving what's taking place within those protected areas. There's also fisheries benefits. You're going to have more animals. They can produce more offspring that can benefit the areas outside of that protected area and be available to fishing.
The establishment of a marine protected area here will only displace the fishing effort to a limited extent and will ensure the health of the krill stock.
Antarctica is a vast area, so there's room for strict conservation and also management for the krill fishery. We came here to explore an area that has been proposed for protection by Chile and Argentina. And now I'm more sure than ever that this place has to be protected.
But the protection of this irreplaceable treasure requires bold international cooperation in support of Argentina and Chile's proposal. Antarctica can be an example to the world of what the international community can accomplish when it comes together and puts the environment first.
parte de todos estar comprometidos y además sabiendo que existe una forma de generar un desarrollo sostenible.
La Antártica es fundamental para el planeta Tierra y para la humanidad. Y creo que llegó el tiempo de cuidar y proteger mejor nuestra Antártica y nuestros océanos.
Hi, everybody. So I'll be telling you how the Southern Ocean has been affected by the climate change. And I have been infected by the Southern Ocean beauty and the research during my PhD years while I was working for British Antarctic Survey. And now I do most of the research in the Arctic and trying to compare and contrast the two regions. All right, so setting up the stage for why we should keep the emissions below 1.5 in this particular case, and also setting up the stage for my future speakers to build on. All right, so we've known that the polar regions are really one of the most vulnerable regions in the world. We have now gotten actually quite a lot of data to demonstrate that the chemistry is changing at the unprecedented rate. And marine communities, biodiversity, and ecosystem services have already started to change, but will continue to do so in the future. And all that is dependent on what sort of scenarios will follow. But despite all this, high uncertainty in ecological and ecosystem responses still exist. And if we don't know how these ecosystems will respond, how can we actually adapt and how can we actually mitigate? And that's very much, in the terms of Southern Ocean, it's very much affected the ecosystem services, mostly the fisheries and the CO2 uptake. And so from that perspective, it's really important to set up the scientific stage in order to talk about the resilience later on. If we talk about the framework for the risk and resilience in the Southern Ocean, we of course have to understand the ocean chemistry, how it's changing under the climate change conditions, and what is already the natural variability in it, so we can start understanding the exposure of marine ecosystems and biological systems and what their vulnerability is. So this creates the platform for evaluating the risk and disaster. But it doesn't end here, really. On the feedback, there are solutions. So what sort of management practices are in place? What can we do in order to mitigate the risk? And at the end, the governance. And that should really happen on local, national, and international level, especially for the Southern Ocean, in order to mitigate the risk as much as possible. Here I'm showing you, so now we're going into the exposure and how quickly the changes are happening in the Southern Ocean or the polar regions, and that is best understood if we're actually looking at it from the global perspective. Here the surface ocean pH change from the pre-industrial times to 2100 using the most severe 8.5 CO2 emission scenarios, and as you can start seeing that the Arctic and the Antarctic are actually the regions that will be acidifying the most. So acidification is just one of the multiple stressors that will be affecting the polar oceans first. So this is the pH. The other one is the saturation state, and I'm introducing this term just to help you understand the biological responses I'll be talking about in the future, I mean in the next slides. And saturation state is actually the level of corrosiveness in the water. So the higher saturation state, calcium carbonate actually can precipitate, but under the saturation state of 1, the calcium carbonate starts dissolving, and this is where pelagic and benthic calcifiers actually become at risk. All right, so we're always talking about the global changes and how that affects marine ecosystems. But it's really important to understand the regionally specific changes. That's much more important to understand that local ecosystem, that regional ecosystem you're dealing with. So in terms of Southern Ocean, that's one of the case for that. Also, in comparison with the global rates, polar ecosystems and specifically the Southern Oceans are really changing much more rapidly. And the oceanification is just one of the stressors. Warming, stratification, nutrient limitation, loss of ice are multiple stressors that are not occurring in isolation. So when you're thinking about the biology, how it's changing, is not just enough to follow the global mean. It's actually, we have to think about the duration, the frequency of the events that these organisms are exposed to. This is really the template or the baseline that creates this biological sensitivity. And very often I use these thresholds as a tools of how we can actually understand and project the implications of climate change on marine ecosystems. Thresholds, as here defined, are the values that are characterizing significant negative biological response. Often we talk about as point of no return, of irreversible changes once these thresholds are passed. So these are the long-term projections of acidification in the Southern Ocean. I'm sorry, I'm biased to oceanification because that's my main research topic, but it really is that it's within the multiple stressors. So what we see here is the changes in the level of corrosiveness in the Southern Ocean as well as pH. And what's really obvious that these systems are really vulnerable to ocean acidification. So even small additions of CO2 can create the conditions where the changes are falling and creating the corrosive effects. And regardless of the scenario, these corrosive effects will start happening within the decades in the polar regions, first in the Arctic and then in the Antarctic. But if you look at the thresholds in here, this is where some more severe biological effects will start to happen. But we now know that actually moderate responses or negative effects can happen at much higher thresholds, so at less corrosive conditions. And if you follow this, and this is really the difference between 1.5 and 2 degree scenario, is why we should be keeping the emissions below 450 or translated as to 1.5 scenario. But it's not just about the trends, right? When we are talking about the stressors and oceanification just being one of them, we have to think about other impacts on the biology. And here really the two different scenarios that I would like to show you how the saturation state, the area of the favorable or unfavorable conditions that pelagic systems are encountering, as well as the frequency of conditions are changing under these two scenarios. So first is 450 ppm in here and the other 550. And if we just look at the percent of the suitable or favorable conditions, we see that that small difference of 500 ppm can mean 40% reduction of the suitable pelagic habitat for the calcifiers. Equally, we're going to see 5 times longer duration of the corrosive conditions. And in terms of the duration of the effects on the biological conditions, twice as long. This particular case is for the Weddell Sea, which is one of the more sensitive regions in the Southern Ocean. So really massive changes just by a slight increase of the scenario. Okay, going into biological effects, now that we understand how the thresholds and the carbonochemistry changes, when we are talking about the oceanification, we have to realize that it's not really just the saturation state, so the corrosive waters. Fish are, for example, very sensitive to pH, to hypercapnia, as depicted by CO2 conditions. And we can have multiple of different effects, starting on the organismal level. So the level of calcification, for example, has been going down in the past 20 years. That has an impact on the physiology, recruitment, and survival. And very easily we can get from this organismal level effect to population level effects. And that changes the food webs, biogeography, the biodiversity, and also the ecosystem services. But what's really important to note in here is that OA is really not happening in isolation. There are multiple factors on either a global level, on a regional level. In this particular case, in the Arctic, it's the temperature that can amplify the other stressors and also impact all the biological effects, as well as these more regional effects. And especially important in the Antarctic is the change of light conditions, sea ice change, so sea loss change, and then changes in acidification that basically limit the nutrients that are available for the species. Here I'm just trying to tell you a bit of a story of these pelagic calcifiers called theropods. There are species currently used as indicators for ocean acidification. A lot of governments have already implemented them in the plans of tracking their ocean acidification in their local and regional waters, and not just measuring the carbonate chemistry on a local level. So these organisms are actually shelled pelagic snails. They belong to zooplankton. They have these very thin shells, as you can see it in here, and that shell starts to dissolve under corrosive conditions when we are basically acidifying the oceans. What's really important is they're a food source for a variety of different organisms across many different trophic levels, and also contribute to the carbon pump. But also ideal sentinels because they can actually respond to very small changes in the ocean acidification conditions. And usually we cannot monitor a lot of species in the ecosystems to see how they are doing, how much they have been affected by stressors in their environment. So if we can have an indicator, in this particular case, theropods are indicators for the ecosystem health, we can actually start thinking how the other species have been affected. And most important, we usually think about the projections, right, and how the species will be affected in a certain systems. Here, very important to know that these theropods have already been severely impacted in the Southern Ocean. And this is how they look like, right? So we would be thinking, okay, when we go out, and so this is the study from 2012, we're going to find theropods with these pristine shells. But actually, this is what we see in the Southern Ocean. So very dissolved, severely dissolved shells. Those are much more vulnerable to predation, to infection. And so it gives us the indication to what extent we have changed the natural conditions in the Southern Ocean. This study specifically was important because it delineated that it was not just that natural processes that changed these theropods. It was really the addition of this anthropogenic carbon pumped into the ocean that changed the conditions to the extent that we have seen these theropods. So now if we think about the difference between 450 and 550, so 1.5 versus 2, why that is important, and it's not just precautionary principle. In ideal scenario, we would have theropods with fairly pristine shell, and as we continue to acidify the ocean and go into this realm of 400 ppms, we're going to start seeing the first indication of shell dissolution on their shell, basically. But this is kind of like a minor effect on the theropods. They can still repair their shell, and it does not really contribute to any population level effects. However, if we continue going that route, the shell really becomes severely impacted, and we can see how much more impact there is on a shell. So they have to put a lot of energy in order to repair their shells. So this is where they have to put the energy into repair, and they cannot grow or retain their vital biological processes. So from this onwards, we can really start talking about how the population level will affect these theropods. And from that on, this is a food source for the fish, and how the fish will be affected as well. But obviously, it's not just about the shell dissolution. Shell dissolution, as monitored, can really help us understand what habitat we're losing in the Southern Ocean due to continued emissions. And by 2010, we can see that only the Ross Sea and the Weddell Sea, most vulnerable regions in the Southern Ocean, have been affected in terms of habitat loss. But just in 20 years' time, on the projection as we are now, which means the warming of 1.5 degrees, we're going to see much more of the coastal Antarctic, and as well as the two systems being much more affected. And in 40 years' time, you can see that the entire system of the Southern Ocean is basically already affected by ocean acidification. So these are massive changes that are happening on a decadal scales if we are not doing anything about stopping the emissions. Here, obviously, now trying to bring some other stressors into the picture as well. So it's not just OA, it's multiple stressors in the Southern Ocean that can cumulatively actually impact the ecosystem. So when you're thinking about how the changes are actually happening, you have to think about these multiple stressors. And so here I've indicated some of the more negative effects, including the ocean warming, the changes in the foraging ground, acidification, and also the regional sea changes. And those really have a mostly negative effects on biota here in the Southern Ocean. If sometimes the color is violet, that means mixed effects. That is just due to some of the regions reacting differently. So in some of the regions you will have more severe negative effects and in some less. And that is the indication of the mixed effect. It doesn't actually indicate that there will be positive and negative effects. But on the other hand, we will have some positive effects in here, mostly because we are losing the ice, and because of the warming, we're going to see the increase in the phytoplankton production. But the caveat here is that actually the phytoplankton in the Southern Ocean is very susceptible to ocean acidification. So we actually really don't know how even the primary production within the Southern Ocean will respond to climate change in here. Obviously, as mentioned, krill being one of the most important species in here, and we can see that it's affected negatively by multiple stressors, by warming, acidification, and the sea ice change. And for that, we actually have medium confidence, which means that a lot of studies have confirmed multiple times the negative effects of this, the most important player in the Southern Ocean. And my last slide is, or pre-last slide, is really just more specific concerns for the Southern Ocean ecosystem and what we have to think in more near-term future and where the resilience option could actually chime in. So the first one is really the changes in the species biogeography. We know that krill has this circumpolar distribution in the Southern Ocean, but now it's moving southwards. It's actually following this colder temperature to search for more optimum habitats for the growth and the recruitment. But that means that it's actually, this is the areas where it becomes the competition, it's reduced habitat that they can inhabit. On the other hand, we are also, there's a prediction that the habitat loss for the myctophytes, these are really the most diverse and the most abundant mesopelagic fish, are losing their habitats or will continue losing the habitats. And why they're important? Because they are really the conduit of energy between lower and higher trophic levels. So that's first one. The second is really the loss of biodiversity, especially when it comes to the benthic communities impacted by the less ice, the more light actually penetrates in, and the microalgae beds can replace these invertebrates. And so obviously the native species are really endangered because of this process. The third one is replacement, and that's mostly related to fish. Fish in the Southern Ocean have very narrow thermal tolerance, and that especially when we are considering the egg, because the eggs and the larvae are actually under increased mortality stress under high temperature. That has importance for the connectivity. So right now, then the population connectivity cannot be established. And really important competition between the two toothfish species, the Antarctic toothfish versus the Patagonian, where actually Patagonian is actually displacing the Antarctic one. And lastly, the changes for the pelagic food webs. When we are talking about the management in the Southern Ocean and really the resource management, it comes to krill and the toothfish. If we understand how the food webs are functioning, and they're functioning in two ways, they can be either short trophic waves from the krill to top predators or via copepods and mesopelagic species. And because of the relative importance changing between these two pathways, that's going to be the most important link how we should really manage our resources in the Southern Ocean. Okay, the last slide here, just to establish some sort of framework from the research perspective going into the solution. First, we really need to understand the exposure in here because that can help us link it to socioeconomic implications. Understanding the sensitivity and adaptability of different species, especially their threshold values, and that's going to help us understand where the hotspots for multiple stressors are so we can start mapping the vulnerability, and that also impacts the ecosystem services. And moving forward towards solutions, obviously management from short-term to long-term, but there are many, many solutions in between, from the governance to capacity building, spatial planning, and so on and so forth that my speakers will address. And right now, I'll just leave it at this, and we'll be taking the questions later.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Jessie O'Reilly. I'm from Indiana University, Bloomington. And as you perhaps can tell by my Twitter handle, I am an anthropologist of Antarctica. So I have been studying for about a decade and a half how Antarctic science translates into environmental decision making. And that's what I hope to talk to you about for the next few minutes. So I'm going to talk to you about the Antarctic Treaty System. In general, the Antarctic Treaty System is concerned with ocean and land below 60 degrees south latitude. The treaty that anchors the system is the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, a post-Cold War document. And I will also be talking about CAMLR, the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources from 1982. There are other documents within the Antarctic Treaty System, including protections for flora and fauna, for seals. There was a mining treaty that failed, and that was replaced by the Madrid Protocol for environmental protection. So the Antarctic Treaty, as Sylvia mentioned, is dominantly focused on the land, the continent of Antarctica itself. And this continent is an interesting place because it is free of formal active territory, yet it's really nation full as well. So on this graphic, you can see these colored wedges. Those represent the historic territorial claims. If you're one of these claimant states, you will say those are our territorial claims. I'm from the US, we don't have a claim, so we say that the Antarctic Treaty put these claims on ice. And you'll see these claims overlap. There was a part that wasn't claimed. They're all sort of put aside under the Antarctic Treaty. However, you'll see all these little national flags all over the continent, and those represent the research stations in Antarctica. To become an Antarctic Treaty Party, you have to demonstrate significant scientific presence in the Antarctic. And historically, the most traditional way to do this was to build a research station or 2 or 10. And so that's what you see here. Newer signatories, newer parties to the Antarctic Treaty have been experimenting with scientific presence without building a station to minimize environmental footprints. So they may share stations that already exist or rent facilities that have already been built. So you don't have to have a research station to have a political presence in the Antarctic or in the Antarctic continent. So Kamilar is focused on the oceans, predominantly the living creatures in the Southern Ocean. And what I need to say about this is there are 9 domains in Kamilar, and there's a goal to create a marine protected area in each of these domains. 2 of them already exist in the South Orkney Islands from 2009 and the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area from 2016. And there are several others under negotiation right now. So decision making in the Antarctic Treaty System has a few tools that are called to attention by the delegates more frequently than others. So I'm going to talk about those tools, and then I'm going to talk about a contestation in Kamilar that's hindering some of the marine protected areas from being approved at this time. So one of these tools is consensus. So in the Antarctic Treaty System, you have to have strong consensus in order to pass a measure or a decision. That means any one party that doesn't agree can stymie the entire conversation. So the pros of this are that you know that every party has come to an agreement on whatever decision passes. The cons to consensus is that consensus usually leads to the lowest common denominator. The sort of smallest points of agreement are what manage to get agreed upon. That can make innovation difficult, or sort of course corrections in a direction that you weren't going a little more challenging. Another key point in decision making in the Antarctic is the precautionary principle. This is the idea that if there is new evidence that there are environmental threats in the Antarctic region, that you should make decisions, even temporarily, to protect and to further study those issues until, so it's to protect first and then work on making sure all of your information is in place. So the precautionary principle is frequently invoked. It's invoked on scientific and environmental protection bases, but also it's a political maneuver as well. And then science-based management means 2 different things in the Antarctic Treaty meetings and in Kamilar. So in Kamilar, they have a formal commitment to an ecosystems-based approach. That it's not a fishing treaty, that decisions are to be made looking at the regional and total continental health of the ecosystems that are there. In the Antarctic Treaty, however, science-based decision-making is a little looser. However, because scientific research is the reason that almost every person goes to Antarctica, there is tourism, but most of the sort of long-term human presence in Antarctica are either scientists or people working there to support scientific research. Because of that, there is a particular political power among scientists in decision-making in the Antarctic. I'll point you to my book if you want to know more about that. So what's going on in Kamilar that's making debates about marine protected areas quite challenging is this debate over conservation and rational use. And in some ways, this is a bit of a surprise that conservation and rational use have come to be seen as opposite entities. So conservation, I think, is quite clear. Conservation is in the name, the title of Kamilar. It's also Article 2 of Kamilar. The rational use has been sort of more informally used throughout the history of the institution, but it's really come to stand in for the unrestricted right to fish, as if the right to fish in in the Southern Ocean is as inalienable as the obligation to conserve ecosystems and living things in the Antarctic and Southern Ocean. And so there have been political and academic papers on this issue. The United States and Australia in 2016 submitted a paper to CAMLR talking about the origins and the negotiating history of CAMLR, and really underlining the fact that CAMLR is a conservation organization that allows for fishing in its regulatory framework, but doesn't sort of rubber stamp fishing in its regulatory framework. Fishing is secondary, subsidiary to conservation in CAMLR. However, there are countries, I'm not going to name them, but you can look up the fishing history in the Southern Ocean to get a sense of this, who really are concerned about protecting their economic interests and the fisheries of the Southern Ocean. And so in recent years, it's been a little, there's been tension in CAMLR as they continue to debate these concepts. And those debates have then been shifting over actually into the Antarctic Treaty meetings, where delegates sort of pick up this debate and hash it out repeatedly. All right, so how does the Antarctic Treaty system then fit into where we're at, the UNFCCC? So first I want to say there are pretty significant institutional and geographic boundaries. And really what I mean by that is the Antarctic Treaty really cares about maintaining its institutions below 60 degrees south. They think that their governance system is the best suited for protecting and managing the Antarctic. There's a long history to this. There was the Antarctic question as a frequent and regular agenda item in the United Nations General Assembly. And the Antarctic question was really asking UNGA if Antarctica shouldn't be preserved in the interest of all mankind, or humankind, instead of just those countries wealthy enough to have a scientific presence in the Antarctic. So there's a little bit of institutional boundary work happening there. On the flip side, the Antarctic Treaty System really sees climate decisions as the domain of the UNFCCC, and so they'll defer emissions reductions to this institution whose meeting we're enjoying right now. That doesn't mean that the Antarctic Treaty System can't or won't or doesn't make decisions to promote climate resilience and climate mitigation and adaptation, like marine protected areas. So they're particularly interested in spatial management tools on land and in the ocean. But I do want to point out that the Antarctic and Southern Ocean face climate risks. They're vulnerable to climate change. They also represent severe climate risks if we think about the disintegration of the ice sheets and other potential society-altering catastrophes. So my final point is simply that the Antarctic and Southern Ocean, they need swift global emissions reductions coming from the UNFCCC, and they also need these spatial management tools, including MPAs, to promote regional climate mitigation and resilience. Thank you.
All right, everybody, I'm your closing act, so wake up, everybody, right now. My name is Masha, Kalinina, and I'm with the Pew Charitable Trust. I'm on the High Seas team. It is an honor to be on the same panel as Sylvia Earle. I mean, come on, who gets to do that? But also among such distinguished scientists and academics, I am not one of those things, nor am I distinguished. I'm actually a lawyer, and my parents are both Russian biophysicists. So this apple fell very far from the tree, but I think they're proud that I am now sort of in your sphere, and that is, of course, because our planet is in crisis. So we need all backgrounds on deck. So first, I want to start with a video about krill, and hopefully this will work if I do that. And then if I press play somewhere.
Surrounding the continent of Antarctica, the Southern Ocean makes up only 10% of the global ocean, but it plays an outsized role in the fight against climate change. It is one of the largest regional ocean carbon sinks for atmospheric CO2. This is partly due to Antarctic krill, the largest species within an order of small crustaceans at the center of the food web. Algae store carbon from the atmosphere during photosynthesis, and krill swarms feed on algae near the surface of the water. Then krill swim down to lower depths, and their carbon-filled waste drops down to the water at the bottom of the ocean. And when krill are eaten by predators, including humpback and blue whales, that carbon stays in their bodies for decades as a carbon sink, until they die, sink to the seafloor, and are consumed by deep-sea organisms. In effect, krill are a giant conveyor belt, constantly moving carbon from the surface down. Swarms of krill can number in the trillions of individuals, and when you take their impact in the Southern Ocean as a whole, the carbon they store in the deep ocean is the equivalent of taking 35 million cars off the road every year. Unfortunately, krill and the species that depend on them are under increasing threat, both from climate change and fishing to produce luxury products, including animal feed for farmed fish and krill oil supplements. As a planet, we have to act to protect krill, the ecosystems they uphold, and their critical role in climate change mitigation. Krill are much more valuable in the ocean than out, but to protect them, we need to protect their home. To learn more, visit pewtrusts.org/southern-ocean.
All right. Who thinks that video was super cute? Yes, me too. Well, I do want to start off with, and my talk will cover MPAs broadly and what they deliver, what they give to us. But that the most important thing, of course, we can do for climate change in the oceans is reduce emissions. No one forgets that, and it is critical. But I think we all intuitively understand that when we limit human disruption of nature, we give our planet a better chance to live in balance, right? And so when we protect the Southern Ocean, we are protecting krill, and they can continue to perform the function that you've seen in this video. And this topic of MPAs is especially important now because we have more than 30 governments around the world calling for the protection of at least 30% of the ocean by 2030. So we call this 30 by 30. And this can be done through the Convention on Biological Diversity and its own COP, meeting like this, that will happen in Kunming next fall. So if you take anything away from my talk, it's that MPAs are awesome. And so I will explain why they are so awesome. What do they deliver? So they protect migratory pathways for whales and sea turtles, encouraging connectivity. And of course, I have to preface that they can only do this if they are effectively managed. And generally, we like to see highly and fully protected marine protected areas. They support fisheries and food security. So basically, MPAs are fish factories. So when you protect an area, you allow fish to grow much larger in size and to produce more eggs. Logical. And then there's a spillover effect into neighboring areas outside the MPAs. MPAs support recovery of predators like sharks and tuna, who then also guard this they preserve the health of the ecosystem. There are economic benefits. I've already mentioned fisheries, but also, of course, tourism, where divers are willing to pay much more to swim in a protected area. That's just one example. But of course, for this audience, I want to talk about the MPAs and their value in terms of mitigation and adaptation to climate change. So krill we already talked about, but also MPAs can serve as landing zones for displaced species that are moving as a result of a warming ocean, an ocean that is more acidic and deoxygenized, as we learned yesterday at the event on the IUCN deoxygenation report. Everybody check that out. There are, in MPAs, they enable larger populations of species, which then have greater genetic variability, and that makes them more resilient against altered natural selection pressures from climate change. And then we can bring it closer to the coastline. Mangroves and similar vegetation reduce wave strength, and they can be our first line of defense against extreme weather events like hurricanes. And then, of course, at the COP, we often hear about how damaging it is to clear-cut forests. Well, destruction of the seabed, of the seafloor, where the marine sediment stores carbon, is really tantamount to clear-cutting forests. So when we permit bottom trawling, then we're clear-cutting forests, but of the ocean, the equivalent. So we need to protect areas from bottom trawling. And then just to bring it back to 30 by 30. So I want to tell you about some of the countries who've committed to the call to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030. They include Chile, Palau, Belgium, Germany, France, Jordan, UAE, Mozambique, Uganda, Seychelles, Fiji, Costa Rica, Colombia. So we have this broad spectrum of support, and the number is really only growing. So science tells us that for biodiversity, for food security, for ecosystem services like climate regulation, we need marine protected areas. CAMLAR, as we just heard, is a critical way to create marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean, and this can deliver against that target of 30%. Also, BBNJ, so this treaty that's currently under negotiation at the UN on the high seas could establish a mechanism to create MPAs in areas beyond national jurisdiction. But of course, we also need MPAs in EZs. And so, I think the last message here is that the world leaders that have convened here, but will also continue to meet for the UNFCCC convention as a whole, should really keep in mind the oceans and their value, but also should support the 30 by 30 call and BBNJ, because that's the only way we're going to get there. Thanks so much.
Thank you to all of our speakers. We have time for questions if there's anybody who would like to ask a question. Microphone's coming around.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the talks. They are really good one. And I would like first to give an opinion, a comment, and then a question. The first one, the comment is because you add some new ecosystem services to the Southern Ocean concerning all krill, because it's the biological carbon pump, which is the natural form to export and probably sequester carbon occurring in the Southern Oceans. And so this has to be taken in consideration as well for has another argument in terms of why we need APM. And the question is, how has been the support of this Chilean-Argentine MPA from the rest of the Antarctic Treaty and the rest of the country? So do you receive strong support, or there is some problems to be a reality, this MPA?
Just a short answer. Argentina and Chile have been incredibly strong leaders in creating this MPA in the Antarctic Peninsula. Absolutely. But I talked about some of the other debates happening at CAMLAR that are slowing it down. I'm optimistic that they're going to get there, that the negotiators will get there, because there are really strong proponents, and it just takes some time for the idea to mature to approval.
Okay. So I agree with you that for the carbon pump, it's not just the krill, it's also the theropods, it's copepods, and that should definitely be considered ecosystem services that is currently not right now, right? And so we should think about how to actually put into the ecosystem services. But the other thing is that all these species actually have circumpolar distribution, right? So if you're protecting just part of the MPA, you are not actually protecting that ecosystem service, right? So you have to think either of various strategic planning decisions, mostly related to fisheries and the use of krill as a resource to protect that particular new ecosystem service, right? I'd just like to stress out that protecting the MPAs will not be enough in protecting carbon sinks from the krill.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for this panel. I loved it. We begin with a scientist that is a great communicator, and we really need good communicators in science. And also fantastic to talk about acidification, about the impacts of Antarctica. I loved it. But I wanted to ask a question for you, Masha. You begin saying that you are a lawyer. So what made you work in ocean? First question. And second question, I'm a marine biologist, and I want to know more about policy. Where can I find, is there a place where I can find, in a sum up, what are the laws, the policy, not only for MPAs, but also for access to biodiversity, for example?
Such a good question. The second part. Just in terms of why I became interested in this field was because I love animals. For me, it's my connection to other living beings. I find that we are so centered on our own existence and our own needs as human beings, but we really disregard the needs of other living things that we share this planet with. So it was really an effort to give them a voice. So I see that as my vision, is to lend them a voice that they don't have. They speak languages, they just don't happen to speak a human one, so we can't judge them for that. We should just learn to speak their language instead. But in terms of your second question, I would join groups that share your interest. So there must be a crossover kind of like science and policy, young professionals group, right? And maybe even Anne has some ideas in this sphere. But or attending conferences where that may be a topic for discussion and meeting as many folks as possible. But otherwise, just in terms of legal frameworks, I mean, Google, right? But it's difficult. I mean, really, you have to kind of experience it and like do that work and live in that world to really internalize how the legal mechanisms work. But I'm happy to keep chatting about that. Does anyone else on the panel want to add anything? Or Anne?
No.
Okay.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm Uta, I'm from Germany. I'm a political scientist. And I'm very, very pleased to hear so much about not only the relevance of krill for the food web, but also for the carbon cycle, for the global carbon cycle. And I would like to know more about what is the relevance, the amount, the quantity? Can you quantify this a little bit? Also, the algae that have been mentioned for our oxygen production. So this, what happened there, is not only relevant for the food and food chain in the marine realm and for human beings all over the world, but also for our life support system, the oxygen production and the climate change. So this is really a matter that concerns us all, and so this is a matter to put this as a common heritage, a common concern of mankind, and as a common heritage of mankind. So if anyone touches this krill, these people should in the future be held accountable to threaten our global life support system. So this needs to be changed, and it's very important, I think, for many people to have some numbers in order to underscore the relevance of the losses that are underway and the consequences we are facing. Thank you.
So yes, I agree that putting the numbers on the ecosystem services is absolutely crucial in order to demonstrate what sort of loss we are encountering because of that. I'm just reading the IPCC report, and apparently for the Antarctic krill fishery on an annual basis, $70 million per year. And for the toothfish, which we know is actually can be potentially displacing the Antarctic toothfish as well, it's $200 million per year. No, yes. Those ecosystem services have not been evaluated yet. So this is a minimum number that just comes from the fisheries, nothing else. But I agree, all these ecosystem services have to be piled up in actually to evaluate their real numbers. But you know, evaluating the species service values is so difficult, and we don't even know for the temperate regions where the most research is based on what sort of values they are contributing to the climate services, let alone for the Antarctic resources. I agree. Putting the value on this particular ecosystem services is absolutely crucial. We have no idea. We do not have the number on that. Yes.
So there was a paper on ecosystem services in the Southern Ocean put out by Alex Rogers earlier this year, and then there will be a special issue in Frontiers on climate change and the Southern Ocean that goes a bit more into that as well. There's about 14 papers in that special issue specifically on the impacts of climate change on the Southern Ocean and ecosystem services and processes. So I'd be on the lookout for that first half of next year.
I just have to respond to that in a more general way. It is important to put numbers. We like to account for things, and it gives us a justification. And we're so based on value in terms of dollars or whatever currency we wish to say. But there's a different kind of value that is missing. It's the ethical, it's the moral, and it's the, what is the value of our life support system? What's the value of life itself? Now, insurance agencies do put a value on a human life. I mean, they will give us a number, whether it's what number you would give to your life or not, or somebody you care about. But here's what I think we really need to do in the 10-year framework, our time. Most of us, even those of us who've been around for a while, can anticipate the next 10 years. What we now know that we could not know even 10 years ago. The advance of being able to see what was not seeable before. We did not have enough evidence. We had not been able to connect the dots. We have not been able to speak to one another as effectively as we now can. That's why the kids are a growing, powerful voice, because they're coming along armed with knowledge that was not even knowable when most of the rest of us were kids. And they can see, cut through all this stuff. Well, you've got to have numbers. We have to have value. We have to know what it's worth. We have to know ecosystem service dollars and cents. Get over that. I mean, yes, we need it. I mean, I look forward to this report. But there's a certain level of common sense that we now can see with clarity that the global ecosystems that keep us alive, our life support system, is in trouble. We can also see why. Look in the mirror. And we can see the impacts: acidification, deoxygenation, the loss of diversity. Here's a planet that has taken 4.5 billion years to get just about right for the existence of humankind. Think about the last 4.5 decades when we have done more than during any other period in history to unravel the systems that maintain our security, our life security. Now, it's that same period of time when carbon emissions have gone from here to here. It's the same time when our consumption of ocean wildlife has gone from here to here. It's that same time when we have had access to places, high seas, deep seas, Antarctica, the high Arctic, never before touched by industrial extraction of wildlife. To me, it's almost pathetic that we're discussing how much krill can we extract with high subsidies for a value of 200 million, or whatever the dollar value we want to put on it. They're priceless. It's like saying, what's your heart worth? You take little slivers of your heart, how much can you sacrifice and still have a heart that works? It's the heart of the planet, the biodiversity. It's the chemistry of the planet that is driven by what we've been talking about, the krill. But it's not just the krill, it's the phytoplankton that power the krill. You saw it in that neat little video, that cartoon of sunlight powering the phytoplankton, powers the krill, powers the whales, powers the everything else. And the carbon, it's not just the krill, it's everybody is out there holding the blue carbon. And there's that little kid's book that I don't have a copy of it, but I'm going to get it. The title of it is Everybody Poops. Dogs do it, cats do it, humans do it, krill do it. Every animal does it. Tuna do it. We look at tuna, and all we can think of is, sushi, sashimi, sandwiches, however you like your tuna. I like them alive. I like them as a part like krill. How much wildlife have we extracted? Now, I love the video that's going around now, the analysis of whales and whale poop. It's the carbon cycle, it's the nitrogen cycle, it's the phosphorus cycle, it's the phytoplankton, it's the everything alive that keeps us alive. And why can't we put a value on being alive and keeping the ecosystem Earth functioning, of which the Southern Ocean has a magnified significance? It's less disturbed than many of the other parts of the planet. The high seas, less disturbed. We have a chance before we've wrecked even more of the cycles of life, the chemistry of life, the chemistry of the ocean. It's amazing that it's taken so long to get the ocean on the balance sheet at a climate conference. Quite frankly, Earth without the ocean would not have an atmosphere. Earth without life would not have an atmosphere that we take as something for granted. So let's look at this business of what's the value of ecosystem services? I think we're asking the wrong question.
Well, I think that's a fantastic way to end, so let's give another round of applause to our speakers for sharing with us today.
Thank you all so much for a wonderful day at the Cryosphere Pavilion. It's been absolutely tremendous, and we feel very lucky to have been able to listen to all these talks and these side events. Tomorrow, we have a full day on ice sheets, Greenland, Antarctica, and on sea ice as well. So make sure you come back here tomorrow. And all the talks will be live on Facebook as well. So thank you. Have a nice evening.